Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. Gran Turismo or Forza Motorsport. There was a time when some people really believed that you could only be a fan of one and not the other. After all, these games serve pretty much the exact same niche. They're simulation races that contain a huge variety of cars and tracks, and expansive single-player career modes that make use of them. The comparisons are obvious, however, there are some stranger similarities too. For example, most believe that both series peaked with their 4th mainline entries, and from their 5th title, their debut in their 3rd respective console generation, things started to go off the rails. After this, the two franchises went down very different paths, making direct comparisons between their games not all that relevant. And by the time they finally started to converge again, one series clearly had the upper hand, with the other now being in a state of limbo. In current day, the GT vs Forza rivalry is pretty much done and dusted. When it came to the older games, the discussion of which series was better often just boiled down to console wars era loyalty. If you had a PlayStation, you repped Gran Turismo, and on Xbox, it was Forza all the way. But looking back on it now, free from preconceived biases like these, which series actually did this formula the best? From an outside perspective, it may just seem like they're two sides of the same coin. But having now played through each of these games again, I can tell you that there are some very important, but often overlooked differences. These relate to not just different features or the execution of certain ideas, but to the overall mentality behind the game design, and even the emotional impact they can have on us as players. Okay, so if we're going to compare Gran Turismo and Forza Motorsport, we need to understand the backgrounds of the two series. The idea for Gran Turismo was conceived by one man, Kazunori Yamauchi. In the early 90s, he worked within Sony's music division, until he was selected to be involved with their new PlayStation video game console as a first-party developer. In his mind, he had the concept for a racing game that featured realistic driving physics and an expansive roster of real-world cars. Although it would take him many years to realize his idea, the original Gran Turismo finally debuted in Japan in late 1997 and became an instant sensation. Players were wowed not only by the technical aspects, like the in-depth physics engine and impressive visuals, but also its deep and rewarding gameplay. It was a racing game that could appeal to almost anyone, whether they were a car enthusiast or just a casual gamer. Over the next few years, the series went from strength to strength, cementing Gran Turismo as a major name in the gaming landscape. Although there had been a handful of competitors in those early years, nobody was really able to challenge GT for the crown of the subgenre which they had created. But in the early 2000s, Microsoft was gearing up for their first venture into the console gaming market with the Xbox. They quickly pinpointed Gran Turismo as one of Sony's biggest exclusives, and set to work putting together a team who could create their own simulation racing game. This group would be known as Turn 10 Studios, and after several years of development, they released their first title, 2005's Forza Motorsport. The game was very clearly designed in the mold of Gran Turismo, something which Microsoft themselves didn't shy away from mentioning. The game performed well both critically and commercially, ensuring that there would be sequels. And with Gran Turismo taking their sweet time on their 5th mainline entry, Turn 10 capitalized on this by bringing out 2 games on the Xbox 360 during this period. Once again, these games were viewed very positively, ensuring that when GT finally returned, it was clear that Forza not only had the longevity to stick around, but was now their direct rival. But if we look at that original game, we can find that whilst many aspects of it take after Gran Turismo, such as the car roster with hundreds of varied models, and the career structure with race events catering to these many different cars, there are also some ways in which it sets itself apart. One of the areas that Microsoft really wanted to highlight with the original Xbox was online multiplayer. Whilst Sony did support online connectivity with the PS2, this required an adapter, and many games simply didn't make use of it. This was the case for Gran Turismo, with a couple of limited test versions of GT4 being as close as the series came to online play until the PS3 era. Well, thanks to Xbox Live, online multiplayer was part of Forza from the very first entry, providing a unique way to play in addition to the offline modes. Another advantage that Forza was able to leverage over GT was the presence of cars from the premium European brands, such as Porsche and Ferrari. This was only possible thanks to Microsoft's willingness to open their wallet and pay the licensing fees which Sony and Gran Turismo didn't want to. This is especially true in the case of Porsche. At the time, they had an exclusivity deal with Electronic Arts, and could only appear in these games after being sub-licensed through them at a hefty cost. With Gran Turismo, although Ferraris did appear in the series as early as 2006, the first mainline game to have them wasn't until 2010. As for Porsche, they wouldn't appear until 2017's Gran Turismo Sports, only after their arrangement with EA finally came to an end. Customization was also another area in which Forza excelled over GT. Not only did the game include real-world aftermarket body kits for many cars, along with Forza original parts, there was also an in-depth livery editor where you could create your own custom paint schemes. It would take a massive 12 years until Gran Turismo would get its own version of this, once again in GT Sports. Whilst the features I've talked about were a nice advantage for Forza to have over Gran Turismo initially, they didn't last for long. With Gran Turismo 5, they upped their game in each of these areas, making the playing field much more even. It also has to be said that things like additional brands and customization, whilst good to have, don't fundamentally change the core experience of the game and how you play it. So with that said, let's talk about the AI opponents. When looking at the classic Gran Turismos, so GT1 through 4, the AI was never its strongest point. Whilst they could be fast and capable of giving you good races in certain conditions, they were not very smart. If you were in their way, they would just try to drive through you rather than around you. And with the PS3 games, whilst their awareness was improved considerably, this came at the trade-off of them becoming complete pushovers. Pretty much the opposite problem. On the other hand, Forza's AI has actually been one of the things they've always given a lot of attention to. Ever since the first game, they've employed what they call drivatars. Basically, they're AI drivers that are able to adapt to the player's driving through machine learning. Whilst far from perfect, I do think they're noticeably better than in the equivalent GT games. In FM1, they admittedly can be quite annoying as they're still pretty unaware, but there is a clear improvement in the 360 games. At times, they can be genuinely fast and aggressive, but still prone to the odd hiccup, like braking in places they really shouldn't do. But overall, if I'm looking for some good single-player racing, I definitely choose the older Forza games over the older Gran Turismos. For pretty much as long as Gran Turismo had been around, car damage had been one of its most requested features. But yet again, they were beaten to the punch by the original Forza Motorsport, which included not just cosmetic damage, but also mechanical damage, which affected both the player and the AI cars. This meant that should you choose to have it on, there were actual consequences to smashing into stuff, thus influencing how you approach the driving. Again, this is something that GT5 added to bring it in line with Forza, but it was simply nowhere near as good. The cosmetic damage didn't look as authentic and was very inconsistent across the different cars, and mechanical damage was way more simplified. Not to mention that the collision physics was still pretty awful. In Forza, you could cause damage to individual parts, from the engine to the transmission, steering, suspension, bodywork and more, each with their own effect that would worsen on a percentage scale. But in GT, you can only damage each of the 4 corners as well as the engine, and this wasn't even an option in career mode races. Now for a lot of people, this isn't a big deal, but I feel like it limits the potential of the game in certain ways, such as with endurance races. When it comes to the actual driving physics, an amount of this will come down to personal preference. While some people love to bang on about realism, the truth is that since the vast majority of players don't actually know what it's like to drive a car on the limit in the real world, most will instead judge the handling in these games based on their own assumptions of what it should feel like. An extreme way in which this manifests in some racing games is having significantly reduced grip when driving on snow and ice, because that's just what people expect. However, in reality, there's actually quite a lot of grip thanks to studded snow tyres which can dig into hard surfaces. Anyway, my point is that both the older Gran Turismo and Forza games feel realistic enough, based on my own personal expectations, and of course the technical limitations of the hardware. Given that I grew up as a PlayStation kid, it's no surprise that I've always felt more comfortable with the driving in Gran Turismo, because that's what I'm used to. For me, the handling of the Forza games is still very good, yet there's always a small level of disconnect. But an area that I feel Forza has always had the upper hand in, no matter how you slice it, is the sound. Take a look at this gameplay from GT5. Okay, now let's see the same thing in Forza Motorsport 4. The difference is quite stark. Now, it's no secret that engine sounds have never been a strength of Gran Turismo, the PS3 era in particular being a real low point. Even in more recent games where they've improved considerably, they seem to prioritize just the accuracy of the engine notes rather than the overall soundscape. Forza, on the other hand, traditionally took the approach of trying to embellish the audio design as a whole, and arguably makes the cars sound even better than they do in real life. Purists may take issue with this, but I think that considering they didn't go too over the top with it, it really adds to the experience. It just makes the driving that much more exciting, and helps to amplify the sense of speed. Of course, there are other details that you might have noticed in that FM4 clip that factor into this too, namely the subtle vignettes, camera shake, and pullback effect that each intensify the faster you go. When you put all of this together, I feel confident in saying that if you put the handling to one side, the on-track experience of the classic Forza games easily trumps the classic GTs. By comparison, Gran Turismo can now just seem sterile, and dare I say, mundane. I'm sure you haven't failed to notice that so far I've been very positive towards Forza Motorsport, mostly just pointing out areas where I think it excelled over Gran Turismo. However, this is the part of the video where the turns table. Because whilst there are many things which I think the classic Forza games do objectively better than their GT counterparts, there are some crucial areas where this isn't the case. When considering what made the older Gran Turismo so special, and still enjoyable to revisit in current day, a massive component is the single-player career mode. While stuff like the realistic handling model, game-changing visuals, and huge roster of licensed cars were what drew people to the original Gran Turismo, I've always believed that the single-player experience is what made them stick around. I could go on for hours about what makes the career modes of the older GT games so captivating, and trust me, I already have. But to simplify it as best I can, it mainly comes down to how the game combines both simulation and role-playing elements to make use of their content in interesting ways. No two playthroughs of these games will turn out the same way, simply because you're given so much freedom to make your own decisions and chart your own course. Every design element feeds into another, whether it be earning money from completing races, the ability to buy cars from the dealership, the race events which cater for specific types of cars, and the bonus prize cars you're given for winning said events. I think this is why the first 4 games in particular stand out in the series, because they're the ones that did these elements the best. Whilst they did play around with things from game to game, they're all underpinned by the same basic principles. When talking about classic Forza Motorsports, I feel like there is a much stronger divide between the first 2 games and then the next 2. Starting with the former, it's clear to see just how much they took from the classic GT formula. Pretty much everything I mentioned, from the credits, to the dealerships where you can buy cars, race events organised into different categories, and prize cars earned from those events, it's all copied nearly beat for beat. However, there is one major difference: the level system. In these games, you have a driver level that you can increase by completing races that dictates which race events you can enter and which cars you can buy from the dealers. The classic GT games didn't have this. The nearest equivalent would be the licenses which were required to enter most events. But the key difference is that these licenses could be earned at any time by completing the necessary tests, a process which could take around only an hour in some of these games if you were good enough. Beyond that, you would have free reign to do whatever you wanted to, with the in-game economy now being your only limiting factor. On the contrary, Forza's level system is much more drawn out, as it will take at least 20 hours of gameplay to reach the maximum level 50 and then be given the same degree of freedom. However, by that point, you would have completed most of the game already, so it doesn't really matter. I feel like this subtle change has a huge impact on how you play through these games. You know how some open-world action-adventure games let you go anywhere right from the start, including late-game areas and sometimes even the final boss? Well, I think about the classic GT games in a similar way. Like I said, provided you get those licenses, you can just stroll straight into the late-game events with tougher opponents, and proceed to get your ass handed to you. However, this freedom is one of the things I was talking about earlier that makes these games so interesting to play through, because there is no singular correct way to play these games. If you want to, you can go through completing each individual event in order, or you could try and find an ideal route for progression that gets you into a position of beating late game events in just a few hours. The pace of the career is dictated entirely by your own desire, knowledge of the game, and level of skill. Now compare this to the early Forzas, where the limiting factor isn't how much money you can earn, what cars you own, or even your ability as a driver. Instead, it's all tied to the level system. To me, this makes progression feel pretty arbitrary, since there's no way that you as the player can influence the pace of the game. Even if you've earned enough money to buy some of the best cars, and feel confident enough in your driving skill to beat the late game events, the level cap prevents you from even trying. In my playthroughs of both FM1 and FM2, this is the exact position I found myself in, ready to take on the endgame events. But the level system made it so that I had no choice but to continue grinding away for several hours at events that I otherwise had no reason to do. If anything, the experience of playing these games really made me appreciate Gran Turismo 5. As some of you will know, this game also had a level system that restricted which events you could race in and which cars you could buy. It was quite a controversial feature since most felt that it was totally unnecessary. But what I will say is that I think it's paced much better than the early Forza games. It's nowhere near as drawn out. Clearly, a lot more thought was put into the balancing. In FM1 and FM2, I encountered situations where I unlocked an event at a certain level, but literally could not acquire any cars to use in it until many levels later. And I also experienced the opposite, where I acquired a high-end car from winning an event, but said car was totally unusable for the next several hours of gameplay because I didn't yet have access to any of the race events that it was actually allowed in. One thing I've highlighted many times in Gran Turismo is broken prize cars. Prizes that are simply too good for the event you win them from. Whilst these have the potential to absolutely break the game, I honestly kind of respect them for letting us take advantage of this. And I much prefer this over how Forza deals with similar situations. Whilst the first two games took very strong inspiration from Gran Turismo with their career modes, FM3 and FM4 went in a different direction. This was the point when the series really started to develop its own identity, and these two games are generally considered to be the best in the series by many people. So, what changed? Well, in both cases, you'll find an event list where you can access every race event in the game. Once again, many events are locked behind level caps, but fortunately they're nowhere near as restrictive as the previous games. Whilst you can just go through the event list, completing races, earning credits, and leveling up as you go, this isn't the main career mode as such. Instead, that's Season Play in FM3 and World Tour in FM4. In both cases, these modes take the events from the event list and structure them in a different way. In FM3, Season Play is made up of a set number of years where your goal is to complete the World Championship event in each season. In between the World Championship races, you have to select shorter events to compete in which get added to your calendar. In FM4, the seasons are replaced by tours that visit a set number of tracks, where you then have to choose an event to compete in from a limited number of options that change depending on the cars you own. However, to me, the single biggest change is that you no longer earn prize cars from winning events. Instead, they're now given to you each time you level up. Why I think this matters so much is because it drastically changes the importance of the race events and the decisions that you make as a player. So, let's say that you don't enjoy driving classic muscle cars, for example. Well, in the older Gran Turismos, and even FM1 and FM2, you could end up getting one as a prize car at some point. Of course, that doesn't mean you'll actually drive it, but you will find events specifically for cars like it. And given that each of these events has a specific prize car for beating them, there is a clear incentive. Because not only does it give you the opportunity to make use of your new car, it also gives you a way to earn a prize you otherwise wouldn't get, that can potentially impact your route through the game from that point onwards. All of this means that even if you don't like driving it, there is still a very good reason to. Now compare this to FM3 or FM4. You will end up getting a classic muscle car through leveling up, and you will be given events to use it in. However, since you won't get a prize car from any of these events, there is absolutely no reason to do it if you're not interested in driving this type of car. Now if you ask me, that first scenario is a much more interesting experience, one that actually promotes driving a varied selection of vehicles, rather than just a small number of your personal favourites. It's important to note that whilst you are given a reason to drive them in that first scenario, you're not being forced to. This small design element means that your decisions of which cars to drive and which events to do have no real impact. And not only that, it also makes winning races kind of meaningless too. If you don't win races in either game, the only impact is that you earn a little bit less XP and so level up at a slightly slower rate. There are almost no real consequences to your results. Now, if you talk to anyone who's played these games, in particular FM4, they're almost guaranteed to gush about one thing in the career: the very gradual progression curve. The fact that you start off driving the most basic of city cars and have to slowly work your way up the racing ladder is often seen as one of the biggest strengths of this game's career. In fact, it's often brought up when people discuss how the Horizon games make things way too easy by throwing rewards at you non-stop. An example of how it used to be in the good old days. But I just have one small problem with this notion. Because yes, the game does have a very gradual progression system that feels rewarding and satisfying to work through. However, it almost completely falls apart once you realise a couple of things. Unlike FM1 and FM2, there are no level caps to prevent you from buying faster cars. In theory, this is great, considering that was one of the biggest issues with those two games. However, if you take advantage of this newfound freedom, it exposes a different but related problem. In terms of cars, there are plenty of bargains in this game, particularly in B-Class where you can find cars for sub 20 and even 10 grand. It really only takes a race or two before you can afford one, which represents a massive upgrade over your F-Class starter car. Bear in mind that the rate at which you earn credits is affected by which driving assists you decide to turn off, as this gives you a percentage bonus. But even with no bonus at all, earning decent money doesn't take very long in these games. As I mentioned earlier, whilst there are still level requirements for the events, they are much more lax than in FM1 and FM2. By level 15, you have access to every single event, even ones for the top R1 prototypes. What this means is that you can use your B-Class car straight away, and also upgrade it to use in higher classes as you go. You're aided in doing this by FM4's affinity system, where you can get discounts on upgrades for your car just by completing races with it. If you can get your affinity with a brand to level 4, which will only take a handful of races, you get a 100% discount. That's right, upgrades are now totally free. And by this point, the facade of FM4's incremental progression has completely fallen apart. Now, whilst this does totally shatter the image that most people have of this game's career, on its own, it's not a major issue. After all, I've documented many similar progression skips in the classic GT games, and I still think it's preferable to FM1 and FM2, where even if you manage to get in this position, you're simply not allowed to enjoy your spoils. No, the real problem arises from the set pacing of these games. FM3 Season Play and FM4's World Tour are designed around a set number of race events that you have to work through. So let's say that you do pull off a skip like this at a relatively early point in the game. You can now beat events for faster cars, but because of the way the game's structured, doing so is effectively the same as if you'd just done them with a lower class of car anyway. Like I said, prize cars in these games are attached to each driver level, not the race events. So at this point, you'll still be earning E-Class and D-Class cars. Also, the career doesn't get any shorter. It's still paced as if you were driving those lower performance cars anyway. So what you'll realise is that even though you can skip progression very easily, there's simply nothing to gain by doing this. In essence, it's the same core problem from FM1 and FM2, but just packaged in a different way. In those games, you could easily earn enough money to buy high performance cars early on, but the game didn't give you access to the events where you could use it. In FM3 and FM4, you can buy and use these cars, but the structure of their careers means that doing so impacts nothing. Because of this, almost everyone who plays these games are conditioned to do so in pretty much the same way, by following the guided progression as dictated by the driver level rewards, and not the natural progression as determined by your own skill and what's possible with the assets you have. I believe that this is why so many people to this day still think that FM4's progression is very gradual, even though you can totally destroy it just by doing something as basic as spending the prize money you get from the first race in the game. For me, this is the key difference between the first 4 Gran Turismo games and the first 4 Forza Motorsports. In the former, you're rewarded for using strategy and thinking outside of the box by being given more options that actually progress you, thus giving these career modes a lot of replayability at the cost of potentially making them a bit shorter. But I can honestly say that after playing through each of these Forza titles and understanding how their careers actually work, I have absolutely no desire to play through them again. So, I think that by now you should be able to understand why, whilst I think they're serviceable, I'm not really that impressed with the career modes in the older Forza games. I just don't find them anywhere near as deep or well thought out as the older Gran Turismos. However, I'm sure that there are a lot of you watching who've never thought about these games in this way. It's important to note that when comparing classic GT and classic Forza, everyone will come at it from a different angle. For me personally, I'm a lifelong Gran Turismo player who started back with the third game. And whilst I did briefly dabble with Forza during the 360 era, I didn't have a huge understanding of how these games worked until I recently went back and played them with a more critical eye. As such, I feel like a lot of my criticisms with their careers stem from directly comparing them to the older GTs, because that's my personal benchmark. But where those games were clearly designed with elements of strategy built in particular my personal favourite GT3, which is just pure distilled game design, the older Forzas simply weren't made with that in mind. What's become very clear to me over the course of playing through each of them is that their careers serve as a way to showcase the racing experience, but nothing deeper. And as I've stated already, I think that racing experience is genuinely excellent and easily better than in the equivalent Gran Turismos. But it's the game design, i.e. everything that takes place between the races, that lets them down. Sure, they do have progression systems, which on the surface seem very similar to the GT games, but if you actually try to play through them in a similar way to those games, it just doesn't really work. Coming from the perspective of a long-time GT player, I quickly noticed a trend where I would be impressed with Forza's on-track experience, the racing with the AI, damage model, sense of speed and engine sounds, etc., and then equally disappointed by the off-track stuff, like the career mode structure and reward systems. To me, it seemed to be a very clear divide where Forza did one area much better than GT, but GT was far superior in the other. At least, that's my point of view trying to be as objective as I can. But what's interesting to consider is how this affects the way certain people think depending on which series they grew up with. For example, if you grew up with Forza, I think you're a lot less likely to value interesting game design than the average GT player. And for GT players, we can be more likely to overlook a somewhat dull racing experience than the average Forza player would. When you have intimate experience with one series but not the other, I think that it can condition you to want to play the other in a similar way, and thus highlight its possible shortcomings. But with all of that said, there is one angle to the GT versus Forza debate that's much harder to nail down. I've seen it be mentioned many times over the years that of these two series, Gran Turismo has more soul. I'm sure that many of you watching will agree with this statement, but at the same time, you have to admit that it's pretty vague. What exactly is soul in the context of a racing game, and why do so many people think that GT has more of it than Forza? Well, it's complicated. Ultimately, soul doesn't really have an exact meaning in this context, but the different feelings that people have towards these games is very much real. I think that one major reason stems from how the two series came about. As I mentioned, Gran Turismo was the idea of one man who was passionate about cars and driving, and just wanted a racing game like it to exist. Forza, on the other hand, was a calculated attempt by a multi-billion-dollar company to create a franchise in the same mold as GT for their own console. Regardless of what you think of the quality of the games, these are indisputable facts. And I think that difference in origin does come through in some ways. Gran Turismo, at least in its early years, just felt more personal. Whether it be the design of the menus, or the original music, they just have a certain warmth that's hard to fully describe. Whilst the older Forza games do have an amount of charm as well, it just isn't the same. Even when we look at more recent GT games, they have stuff like unique music that plays at Christmas time, and gift cards that you get on your birthday. I mean, could you really imagine Forza doing stuff like this? Another small but nice thing you'll find in GT are the credits movies. These are often elaborate sequences made using real footage, in-game FMVs, or a mixture of the two, with emotional music playing over them. Yes, they can be super cheesy, but I still love them. On the contrary, I've always felt that the Forza games have been really bad with how they handle their endings. In the original, you just get a text box once you hit level 50. That's it. And when you complete the career in FM4, after the basic credit scroll, the world tour is reset to the beginning, and you're left with no prize to show for beating it. I remember that when I first played through this game many years ago, I was genuinely confused by this. I was almost certain that I had missed something, but no, this is just how it ends. It's almost as if nothing even happened in the first place. Gran Turismo just has so many charming touches and flourishes that feel uniquely Gran Turismo. These don't make the games fundamentally better, but do make the experience of playing them feel more special. And for me, that's one of the key takeaways. Depending on your perspective, the classic Forza games may be better than the classic GTs, but playing Gran Turismo will always feel more special, and crucially, memorable. As someone whose job is to make engaging videos about these games, this is something that I find very apparent. We all remember that one event from an old Gran Turismo game that was insanely tough, or that one where the AI did something really stupid, or that crazy money-making exploit, and so on. These games are just filled with weird and interesting stuff that creates memorable moments that we can all relate to as players who experience them. By comparison, I don't find there are many things that stand out in Forza. Everything just kind of blends into one, and that's partially by design. Whether it be unusual cars, race events, obscure trivia, or series lore, the well always seems to run much deeper with Gran Turismo. There are certain videos that I've made about this series that I know if I tried to do with Forza Motorsport would be nowhere near as interesting, and in some cases I wouldn't be able to make them at all. Now to be clear, more interesting does not mean better. In fact, some of the things I'm talking about could be considered as flaws or even errors. The point is that I think this speaks to the appeal of classic Gran Turismo as a whole. It's not just a series of great racing games, but a unique experience that everyone who played them went through and has their own interesting stories about. This is what makes even just talking about these games with other people so enjoyable. There's a reason why I make videos primarily about Gran Turismo and not Forza. And it's not just because that's what I grew up with. It's also not because they're necessarily superior. As I've explained, I do think Forza is better in many areas, and completely understand why some view these games in a higher regard than the classic GTs. It's simply that I think Gran Turismo as a series warrants the discussion and analysis far more. Like with any work of art, it's the ability for these games to connect with us that makes them so meaningful. To me, that is the soul of Gran Turismo.